Well, hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Terra's Third Thursday. As usual, we're going to wait just a minute or two to let those folks that may be having technical issues or hanging up the phone from a previous conversation to get on board. I've had some technical issues already, so hopefully that will not be a problem. But yeah, just hang tight for a couple minutes and we will start the program typically around 3:02 Eastern time, so just a minute or two. Again, for those that are just joining us, we're holding off for just a couple minutes. We welcome you to Terra's Third Thursday webinar, just giving a little bit of time for everyone to get their computer situations squared away and logged into the webinar. So we'll be beginning in about just 1 minute, so hang tight. All right, I see a couple more people jumping in. If you're not hearing us, it's because we haven't been speaking. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for everybody to log in and get through any technical difficulties they might have. We're going to be starting in just about 1 more minute, so please hang tight. Okay, well, I think that's enough. This is the recorded session anyway, so people can be able to log in and watch it when they want to, for those that aren't going to be able to make it this afternoon. So we're getting started. Welcome everybody to the second installment this year of Terra's Third Thursday webinar for 2022. Want to take a moment to thank all of our Terra members for your support, which makes programs like this possible. I'd like to thank likewise our guests that are here today and remind our guests that Terra members receive this content for free. So, please consider joining. If you have any questions, during the course of this presentation, please use the questions bar or the chat feature that's in your control panel to send questions to myself. I'll be moderating all questions at the end. Everybody that's on this webinar, other than Kelley and myself, are on mute. So after we finish, Terra will make this entire presentation available at our GoToWebinar channel. We'll send out an email to everybody in attendance, and those that registered but couldn't attend, they'll also get a link with a link back to this recording. Then you'll be able to share it with other team members, or if you wanted to rewatch it. Just please remember that you need to use your promo code to provide free access to the next person. We've got 2 promo codes for this particular webinar. We have Certified 22 and we have Greeneye 22, both all caps and the number 22. If you could forward that on to anybody else that wants to watch a recording, this way they don't have to pay for that pleasure. Before we get started, just had a single announcement here. We got some exciting news that we talked about last week at Terra. If you haven't had an opportunity to see it through any of our social media postings or some of the other material that we've sent out, I just want to make you aware that Terra did launch a digital inclusion program with the city of Louisville, Kentucky last week. We're going to be collecting, refurbishing laptops and tablets and getting those back into the hands of needy and underserved people in their communities. Very exciting. This is the second program of this type that we've announced. We've done the first one with the city of Philadelphia. I mentioned that we launched that a couple of months ago, but this was officially announced last Thursday during Mayor Fisher's annual State of the City presentation, which was really exciting for us. So we're pleased to be working with them. The Technology Conservation Group is kind of our operational partner in market that's helping us make this happen. So kudos and thanks to them. And for those of you that may not know, in our Philadelphia program, Thanks for Being Green is our partner there. We'll have a lot of exciting news to share before the end of this quarter. Things are moving very quickly here at Terra in terms of us getting out into the marketplace and providing content and programs that are helping to explain why certification is important, why certification matters. So keep your ears on as we start making some more announcements here in the next couple of weeks. But enough about that. Let's get started. Today, we are very pleased to be addressing the hot and timely topic of the recent changes to the eStewards and the R2 certifications. We are lucky and thankful to have one of our founding allied members, Kelley, who with Greeneye Partners, to serve as our host today. Since 1997, Kelley has been working in the electronics reuse and recycling industry. About 13 years ago, she started Greeneye Partners and has worked with companies preparing them for certification, training auditors and EHS managers, and performing downstream due diligence and audits worldwide. She's also served as an R2 technical advisor. So I'm sure you're all really eager to hear from her and not myself. So I'm going to turn this over to Kelley, and thank you and welcome to Tara.
Hi, everyone. So our intent today is to keep this at a pretty high level and it'd be a pretty short presentation, but there will be an opportunity for questions to dig a little bit deeper. So let's go. Thank you to Tara for having us today. It's a little bit of my background. Steve covered it a little bit there too. The other thing I wanted to note is that not only did I serve on the TAC for 16 years, I just retired last June. I also was a trainer and serve on the technical advisory group for Rios, and also was integral in helping eStewards to create their standard in the early days and give them feedback. So I think I got an award a couple of years ago, and I thought this is an old person award, because the only reason you get an award like that is you've been around for a really long time. So I've been around for a really long time. So we're going to go over the R2v3 updates, the eSteward update, so R2v3 versus R2 2013, eStewards version 4, talk a little bit about resources that are available for you, and then of course information about contacting us if you want to. So R2v3 was updated recently, as you all know. I think it was a year and a half ago that we finally finished our work. The Technical Advisory Committee took 5 years to update it. The Technical Advisory Committee is recyclers, customers, other interested parties. So sometimes when a recycler says to me, why did the group decide to do this particular requirement? I can always fall back on the fact that there were at least 30 people on the TAC. And so imagine that the big stores, Best Buy, Staples, and as well as the manufacturers who use the recyclers, Panasonic, Samsung, Dell, have all been a part of what's called the R2 TAC since its inception in 2006. So it includes a lot of different people. It's not just recyclers, but the intent this time in this upgrade was to really focus on filling any holes and focus on best practices in the industry. So there are almost, I think, over 1,000 R2 certified recyclers worldwide. And as you can imagine, and Steve and I were just talking about this, the transition from 2013 to R2v3 is going to be significant in terms of timing and availability of auditors. And so we'll talk a little bit about that also, because we're coming up on that deadline, which is June 2023. And so we'll talk about that timeline. So what we did really in the change of the R2 standard is we made some structural changes. And what was, I think there were 13 specific sections of the original standard. It now has 10 core requirements that everyone will certify to. And this is a baseline for the industry. So the basic things that were in there before with 13 were reduced to 10. That is sort of the core elements of the standard. There are 6 appendices in the standard that you would certify to based on what you do. And the intent here was really to call out specific things that certain qualified companies do that are only within their skill set. And so when you get a certificate from an R2 certified recycler, you'll know what it is that their specialties are. Anybody that's certified to R2 has to have at least one appendix, and we'll talk about that. The other big change to this standard was the call out for an R2 equipment categorization. It's called the REC. And it really calls out the functionality levels, cosmetic grades, as well as the status of all material under the control of the recycler at any given time. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. While I'm in this section of it, I want to to point out that anybody that's considering getting certified or using certified recyclers should always get copies of the standards that they're having them certified to or that you're going to certify to, and make sure that you read it. So everybody, for the most part, uses a consultant. I don't meet many folks that don't. You don't have to, but it is difficult to do it on your own. It's just a lot of putting together of things that are based on concepts and maybe not specific formats. But I just want to call out, and I'll probably say it a couple times during this presentation, get copies of the standards, get copies of the recs. They are on both of the websites, the eStewards website and the SERI website. It'll make your life a lot easier if you read it. So when we talk about the appendices, remember we have the core, and then we have the rec, which is the equipment categorization, and then we have the appendixes or appendices that a recycler will be certifying to. There are 6 in R2v3. The first one is the downstream. Everybody but an end processor will certify to this. And this is for qualifying all of your downstream activities. It specifically calls out what you need to do for all tiers in that downstream chain for what we call focus materials. And we'll talk about that a little bit coming up. It also has a specific appendix for data security. So these are people that manage data security, either physical sanitization, but more likely wiping, so logical sanitization and physical sanitization. It calls out specific requirements for both software and also particle size, types of physical destruction that are allowed. The next is test and repair. So it has exactly pretty much the same requirements that were in R2 2013, but are much more prescriptive. So it's easier for an auditor to call out certain things when they're on the floor in a facility and ask for demonstration that you're conforming to that requirement. Anybody that does test and repair must also be concurrently certified to ISO 9001 or RIOS for the quality part of that standard. To be R2v3 certified, you also have to be concurrently certified to ISO 14001 and 45001, which are environmental and health and safety, or the RIOS standard, which has environmental health and safety and quality in it. So there's a specific call out for quality on top of the ISO 45 and 14001 if you're doing test and repair. Specialty equipment is called out as an appendix to be certified to if you have over 1% of a total of units on a running 12-month period. So if you only manage less than that, you can include those requirements in the core certification and don't need to add that appendix to your requirements. Material processing is called out specifically when things are broken, cut, melted, heated, crushed. So for example, if you remove components and you use manual teardown techniques like little drills, screwdrivers, you don't need material processing. If you break things, you use crowbars or hammers, or you cut cords, you cut circuit boards or pieces off of circuit boards, you are now into material processing. There are specific health and safety requirements based on your risk assessment that are required when you certify to this particular appendix. The last appendix is brokering, and brokering in the R2 standard is a little bit different than we think of in regular recycler life. So you move material, but you don't take physical control. So for example, if a broker, there's a couple of battery brokers that I know of that have different depots all over the country. So if they drop a battery somewhere and it hits one of their facilities on, it's on the ground, that's not brokering under R2, that's a collection. There are also some brokers that move material to Japan, or I'm trying to think where else, Canada. So the broker might move it there, but it might hit the ground somewhere here in the States or in Japan for an assay and a taxation permit before it moves. That is not considered brokering. So one of the things to consider is when you look at these appendices as an R2 recycler, anybody in your downstream that you're vetting for data security or test and repair or specialty equipment or processing or brokering needs to meet the requirements in these appendices. So it's a lot more complicated than it was before because it's more prescriptive. A lot of the requirements are the same, they just aren't called out as in such a prescriptive nature. The other big change with R2 was the implementation of the R2 equipment categorization, or a lot of people call it the REC. It calls out for identification of the status of the material from the moment you pick it up. So if I'm a recycler and I go out to a commercial building and I pick up, 500 laptops, from the minute I pick it up, it's considered R2 controlled, pre-sanitized. R2 controlled because it's not tested. We don't know if it works. It's got focus materials in it, batteries, circuit boards. Pre-sanitized because it probably has data on it and we're not sure. And if we're not sure, that's what we call it. It also calls out for a grading system for all reusable products. So you test it, you repair it, you know the functionality and cosmetic level of it. You can use their grading categorization or you can use your own and cross-reference. So they give you a specific table. Again, download the rec on the CRE website so you can see what that looks like. You don't have to use their grading systems. You can use your own, but you need to cross-reference to their levels of grading. The intent was that it was based on common and applicable and accepted terminology in the industry, which is a tough thing to do because everybody's got their own type of grading. A lot of you use A, B, C. This one calls out functionality and cosmetic numbers. So take a look at it and see where that might fit in for you. It also requires that the recycler know the status of a product at any time. So if I'm on your floor of your facility and I pick up a unit, I can say to you, where is this in your process? And you can say based on whatever identification mark you want, maybe there's a scan number on it, maybe there's a label taped to it, maybe there's a sticker on it that's a certain color. Kelley, this has been through triage. We know it's got data on it. It's waiting for sanitization and then it'll go to repair, or this is a completely tested working unit that's getting ready for kitting and selling. So the intent was that there weren't these strange boxes of things in the backs of facilities where nobody knew where they were or when they came in. It doesn't require to have a sophisticated inventory system, but those can make things easier. So I have clients that have very fancy and expensive scanning systems, and I have clients that keep things on spreadsheets. So depending on the size or how much you're investing in this, you can be all over the board with how you track things in and out of your facilities, but you do need to be able to show that you know what's on the floor, what the status is of the material, and you can demonstrate that to an auditor. It actually makes you a better business person in the long run because I think it reduces loss, but it will be a big change for some people. Under data security and sanitization, the changes were significant in this standard. There are specific tasks for data sanitization and having a data sanitization plan. There's a requirement for a security procedure, and depending on what type of work you do, camera requirements, storage requirements, and storing things protectively from the minute you receive them if you know they have data on them or think that they do. It requires that a particular person is called out as a data protection manager, and they're responsible for everything that surrounds data containing and management of that. It requires an annual audit of both the plan and the security procedure by an independent party, which can be someone in-house, but you need to demonstrate they're competent and they don't have any activities as part of their work requirements around data. It requires downstream facilities who provide data sanitization or destruction to be either R2v3 or audited by a CRE-approved third-party auditor. So that's a big change for this standard. It also it specifies the type of physical destruction that's allowed. There's a table in Appendix B that clearly calls out what technologies are allowed for certain types of material in terms of physical sanitization. And then it also requires software for logical sanitization. There's no device reset allowed. So you need to be able to demonstrate through a software provider or whatever it is that you are using on site. It can be also an in-house created software that the device is sanitized. You just can't reset to factory defaults. The downstream vendor part of the new standard is also significant. It is the same requirements, but they're called out differently, and the auditors are looking for that objective evidence to show that you're doing that due diligence. It is as it was before for FM recyclers all the way to end of life. You are needing to, depending on what those facilities do, vet them to the requirements in those appendices. So when I talked about Appendix A, which is downstream recycling, you need to vet your downstream vendors to all of those requirements, regardless of the tiers. You have an opportunity with this standard, as well as the eStewards standard, and we'll talk about this, to reduce that requirement. So once you're R2v3, if you choose to register your downstream with the CIRI organization, anybody that you send material to that is also R2v3, all you need from them is their certificate and to make sure that the appendices that they're certified to meet the requirements for the material you're sending them. So there's an ability to decrease that work depending on what your downstream looks like. But in this transition year, not everybody is up to R2v3. So there's a lot of these audits going on. This is going to be a tough year and a half here until everybody's R2v3. There is a very specific requirement for data containing devices if sending downstream, and we talked about that a little bit. Test and repair, there are specific requirements for the levels of testing depending on what it is and how you document that. It also has specific requirements in the categorization, what you can call tested, repaired, and how you grade it. We talked about that before in the rec, the R2 equipment categorization. It also calls out auditing practices for companies sending out to others for test and repair. So if you send to another company for test and repair, they need to not only have some way to manage legal requirements, but also be certified to either 9000 or RIOS. So anybody that does test and repair for you, if you're R2v3 certified or preparing for that, they need to be certified to a quality standard. So we talk about resources. I really want to drive people to, we're going to put these on here, but I think it's just best to drive you to the website. CIRI has a very, very good knowledge base where you can find videos on almost every part of the standard. There's a lot of frequently asked questions. I would highly recommend, if you're considering becoming certified to R2v3, to take the lead auditor training. I think it's 2 days. It's done by an excellent trainer. Her name's Sarah Smart. She's been an ISO auditor for many years. She knows our new standard really well. And the training gives you so much knowledge that it really helps. And even if you're using a consultant, I highly recommend taking the training. There's internal auditor training that we have on our website for R2 2013, but I think it's worth it to take the lead auditor training with CIRI, but also check out the knowledge base on the CIRI website. Did we want to stop, Steve, and see if there are any R2 specific questions, or do you want me to just run through everything and see how people do with questions?
Well, one question did come in, Kelley, talking about the question is, why does a broker need a QMS if all they're doing is arranging trucking and they never see the material?
Yeah. So that was really about, I'm thinking back to what the intent was of the TAC at the time. It was one that I argued a lot, but I didn't win. For quality of managing bill of ladings, internal processes to make sure that information was getting across correctly to recyclers. So one of the problems that people saw a lot is when they were managing downstreams or auditing downstreams or trying to get correct information from brokers was things being called different things than they were. So one of my favorite is mixed electronics. And in this particular case, mixed electronics were flat screen TVs going all over the world, but being called mixed electronics. And so the intent was that the broker had some kind of a quality system in place to manage their processes. So they were consistent, understandable. There's just a lot of things around brokers that make it hard to track materials if they're not doing things well and are really unorganized. An example would be a tracker that ended up in a load and trying to find something happened in the shipping container, and the shipping container got changed to another carrier. And so it was really hard to figure out, when there was a GPS in this particular load, how it went and how it got to where it got to, because the company that was the broker was so unorganized and didn't have any policies or procedures in place to have any consistency in terms of customer notification, confidentiality around that, calling things something consistently. being able to demonstrate that they actually received the material at the point of processing. So one of the things that people on the TAC decided made sense to make that easier in terms of tracking was for them to have a quality standard in place. So remember, it's really important to remember that when we're talking about a broker, it's only going to apply to a few of your brokers. So most of the metals brokers, most of the battery brokers take possession of the material at some point. And even if that possession is only when it hits the country of origin and they're doing an assay to get their import permission, there's only a few brokers that don't take possession. And I've been working with them as quickly as I can, as a few other consultants too, to get them up to 9001. I hope that helps. Any other questions?
Yeah, and I guess this could probably go for, either folks that are eStewards or R2. And that is, with the new updates being, more challenging than perhaps before, is there a situation where you mentioned that some companies are still using spreadsheets versus an ERP system? Is it, do you believe that a company could still get by without an ERP system, or should they, do they need one? And if so, are there some others maybe that don't want to get too much into the recommendation side, but there's some companies that people should be really asking to see their wares?
So the thing about an ERP is that it makes you a better company, and I think it gives you better control over your inventory. I know this is a terrible thing to say, but I think a lot of companies have a lot more theft than they realize. And I think that an ERP helps with that, tracking, knowing your inbound, your outbound. I've even seen these crazy theft stories where somebody was buying certified OEM screens to replace on phones, but then they were buying crappy ones online and bringing them in and using those to replace the screens on the phone and taking home the OEM screens and selling those. And the only way they caught it was through their RMAs. They kept getting these returns on these screens and they couldn't figure out why. And then they looked at the screens and they weren't. Anyway, there's all sorts of stuff that happens. And I think inventory control helps reduce that. I come from the recycling and waste industry, and I can't tell you how many times I've been so surprised that people that had ghost loads going out in the morning before any managers got there, and they were all just splitting the cash together. Do I think that everybody's inherently a criminal? No. But do ERP systems help to manage inventory? Yeah. There's no way they don't. But they're also a huge cost for folks. So like I said, I have people that get material in the door and they put an orange dot on it or a green dot on it, and that's all they do. And that's how they track stuff through their facility. They don't do reuse, they don't do data management, they just do downstream, but they can keep it that easy. I have other facilities that have really nice spreadsheets and they track it that way. I think it's really important to think about how it will change your business once you start really looking at your inbound and outbound in your inventory. And it doesn't need to be a fancy process. It's nice to have a fancy process, but it's a lot of money to do that. But almost everyone I've talked to said it has been such a game changer for them if they're doing it manually and simply or with an ERP in terms of loss, inventory control, and management of parts and components. I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. And one last thing here before we kind of jump off to the eStewards for a moment. Because there has been these changes, there's a lot of deadlines coming up. If you might be able to speak to maybe some of the deadlines that people are going to be up against here related to both standards before you kind of jump into eStewards.
Sure. So the biggest deadline, of course, will be with R2v3. The standard sunsets in, I think it's June 2023. It might be July. I think it's June. That means that your standard, if you're R2 2013, your certificates will no longer be valid after that time. So that's a hard stop, but here's how that backs up. All the certification bodies are going to want you to have your audit at least 3 months prior to that, because any non-conformances in the R2v3 standard will make it so that you can't be certified. They will not recommend you for certification if you have open non-conformances. That's a change, and that's not what ISO or RIOS do. So you have to close them out. And their process for closing things out, as most of you know, takes some time. They have to have several reviews. R2v3 also requires a return audit. That's either remote or on-site if you have any open non-conformances at the end of your stage 2 audit. That's again more time for scheduling, getting somebody that's available, and then another review of your closeout. So they want you to have at least 3 months. So let me give you a couple scenarios of folks that I've been working with the last couple weeks. So I have a few people that have their audits this fall, for example, but their certificates don't expire until June of next year. If they have their audit in November to R2 2013, they're going to turn around in March. So remember, that's 5 months later, 4 months later, turn around in March and have a second audit to R2v3. So you have 2 audit costs in less than a 6-month period of time. You have 2 internal audits in less than a 6-month period of time. So if you have an R2 2013 audit in Q4 of this year and maybe even in Q3, if it were me, I would go ahead and upgrade your documents now and make sure that you do that audit this fall to R2v3. Not just because of the fact that you'll have another audit within 6 months, but I'm really concerned about there being enough auditors to audit all of you if you're going to get audited in March, January, February, March. With COVID and, a lot of auditors are older, my age, they all kind of went, I don't want to do this anymore. So what's happened is we have less auditors out there, and there are 1,000 certified R2v3 companies in the world right now. I was telling Steve that we have about 450 active clients, and maybe 375 of them are R2, and we support them all at different levels, but for the most part, I will know that I'll be upgrading their documents, but we've probably upgraded 120 sets of documents, and maybe 60 of our clients have gone through their audits. So I feel impending doom coming, and I would just reiterate to anybody that's R2 certified that thinks they're going to put it off until March of next year to not do that. So we're really trying to push our clients to do it earlier, but the other reason is I want 6 months at least, or 3 months to work with my clients, our clients, to get them ready, because there's a lot of changes and I don't want them to be rushing at the last minute. And I don't want them to have a lot of non-conformances and have return audits. And, maybe they're going to have 1 or 2, that's acceptable. But so I want everybody to just think about their timeline. I mean, Siri's really been pushing that. We've been pushing it with our clients, and the certification bodies have been too. But it's hard to get people's heads around it when they look at their certificate and it says it expires in June of 2023. They're like, oh, I have till June. Not really. And eStewards hard stop date already passed. It was last year, I think in September, but their hard stop date is the addition of NAID to their standard. Mm-hmm. So that ends in June of this year. So most of our eSteward clients are just working and finishing up their NAID audits. And remember, NAID is a separate audit process. So not only do you have to implement it, you also have to get an auditor and do that work with iSigma to set up that audit. And that's a separate audit process. So it has to be done before your eSteward audit, so your auditor can verify you've completed that. Otherwise, you would be out of conformance in that section of your eSteward audit, if that makes sense.
So just to kind of put a final question on this little section before you get into the eStewards, what would be an acceptable timeline that you think people should follow from I'm getting ready to either renew or switch my standard from one to the other to the day I'm going to get that certification in my hand? How much time should I be planning?
So I'm recommending that our clients start updating their documents 3 to 6 months before their internal audit. I recommend that they have their internal audit 6 to 8 weeks before their stage 1 audit or their upgrade audit. The other thing that's been happening is because the certification bodies are really backed up. Many of you know that. It's been hard to just schedule audits, let alone get return emails from many of them. It's also taking time from your stage 2 audit to get your certificate delivered to you. So our first, and I think it might have been the first or second R2v3 audit, was one of our clients in February of last year, and they got their certificate in October. It's not that bad now, but Perry Johnson did tell one of our clients last week that it was 120 days after their stage 2 to issue your certificate. It doesn't mean you're suspended during that time. It just means you don't have a certificate to give to your vendors. So one of the things about R2 that's kind of cool is that if you send to an R2v3 certified recycler, you don't have to worry about doing that downstream due diligence. But if they can't give you a certificate that shows they're certified because they're still waiting for it for 3 months from their certification body, all of that kind of gets stretched out for everybody. So everybody keeps wanting to put it off because they think it's really hard, but so a lot of the people that I'm working with right now have audits in the fall, and we're upgrading their documents. I'm doing their training with them. You know, whatever support level they choose to work with from us, we're starting that now with them so that we hope they'll be ready in September, October, November, December for those audits. So it's just a longer timeline for getting stuff done. And the people that have the longer timeline, you would think they would procrastinate more, but actually their outcomes have been great. I've had some people that did emergency updates. You know, they was like all of a sudden realized they weren't listening to me and they weren't listening to their certification body, and their next audit, which was going to be in 6 weeks, needs to be to R2v3, and we've pushed through and gotten everything. They've just ended up with 5 or 6 non-conformances. Then they have to have a return audit, and that's just painful. I mean, they've made it through it, but it's just painful. And they knew going in that that was a possibility, but it's not, it's just more painful than taking the time and getting everything upgraded. So I would do it early, I would do it soon, and I would give yourself as much time as you have to do that upgrade. Have I scared?
Well, we've been hearing a lot of rumor mill and buzz at Terra about some people, potentially transitioning to eStewards, so I don't want to give them short shrift. So let's go into kind of eStewards updates and kind of what their changes have mean for potentially our members.
Sure. So those of you that had known the eStewards standard, it was always historically very long and complicated. We used to kind of laugh that it was written in legalese and took a lot of time to kind of cipher through everything. And BAN knew that. So the standard had become long. They had also integrated ISO 14001 into the actual language of the standard. The industry has also changed, and data security really, even though it's been on my forefront for 15 years, it's just much more on everyone's forefront with things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years. eStewards has a very strong GPS tracker program, so they felt like that has helped reduce some of their downstream vendor liabilities, and I would agree with them 100%. They have a team of recyclers and other stakeholders that participated, so people that were really using the standard on the ground, created the new standard, worked to update it. So that's always helpful. And then we really resulted in a much more streamlined and accessible and easy to read and understand standard. They did a really good job in that. They took out 14,001. It still follows that structure, but it's familiar, but it doesn't include the standard itself. They also used to have a lot of how-tos in the standard itself. They moved those into a guidance document. That's very good. They combined related sections, so there's no redundancies, so it was shortened quite a bit. It incorporates the NAID standard, and that is in July of 2022, I think, and maybe June. I always forget the month. There is an Appendix D that you would certify to if you were certifying to right now, but most people are doing NAID at this point because it's so close. It also added the latest Basel Convention amendments, and we'll talk about that. It added something called tolling. And again, I'm just doing a high level view of these standards and additions. So we'll talk about that a little bit. It also added extended producer responsibility conformity, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They also changed what they called things. So their main nomenclature was materials of concern, or MOWs, and HEW, which is hazardous electronic waste. They added something called hazardous electronic equipment. They also changed what they call their management system to an SMS, for stewardship management system. So when they changed HEE, when they added HEE, it also now includes plastics, which are listed on 8 or Basel 2 or Annex 2 of the Basel Convention. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Oops. So plastics is a big call out in the eStewards standard. R2 requires demonstration of compliance for exporting, but eStewards is very specific in that they call out plastics listed on 8 or Annex 2 of the convention itself, and these are new. And although the United States, North America, Canada, only 36 or 37 countries follow the ban amendment for the Basel Convention, eStewards requires voluntary compliance with it as though you are in a country that's a signature to it or are part of the Basel ban, accept those conventions as well. So after the 1st of January, plastic waste is a hazardous electronic waste if it falls under any of these 4 exceptions, unless it falls under any of these exceptions. And there aren't a lot of situations where this occurs, and you can probably imagine where. So unless it's single non-halogenated polymer, which means it has no brominated flame retardants in it, which is something most of us are not able to tell on our recycle floors, or it's a mixture of PET, PP, and PE. Again, you're looking at plastic stamps on plastic units and making that determination, or it's a cured resin or condensation product, or has 6 fluorinated polymers and are not contaminated and are going to mechanical separation. So plastics are a hazardous waste unless they meet those requirements. It adds a large amount of plastics to what we consider hazardous electronic waste, which are not exportable to developing countries under the eStewards standard and for any countries where the country has ratified the Basel Amendment. I know this is really confusing stuff, but here's an idea of what this means. In the US, you cannot send plastics to Malaysia, which is where more plastics go at this point, or Taiwan, because the US is an OECD country and Malaysia and Taiwan are non-OECD countries. You are not allowed to send hazardous electronic waste to a developing country. So it's a big change. It sort of is required in R2 because you would have to demonstrate that it's a legal import, which is getting more and more difficult because countries like Malaysia and Taiwan are saying, yeah, you're right, we're not going to accept this stuff here. It's just really specifically called out in eStewards, regardless of what country you're in and whether or not you've ratified the Basel Treaty. I'm trying to keep this high level and it's hard to do that. There might be questions. We'll see where we end up. eStewards V4 also, I shouldn't call it V4, eStewards 4.0 also adds something called tolling. So tolling is where, this happens a lot in the mobility world. Say I get mobile phones in, but I'm not able to remove batteries from them, bad batteries from them. I just don't have that capability at my facility. I send it to another company down the street. They have an ability to remove the batteries safely and then return the devices to me. So I can, as an eSteward, do tolling operations, which means I might do repair, sorting, triage. I might just wipe screens. I might do the polishing on the back of a phone. That's all I do. And then I put all the equipment back to my original customer. I never take ownership of it. And it's permitted when eStewards has a requirement that any fractions remain in control of the original organization. So if I send you a bunch of phones for you to do testing and 50% of them are junk and they're just pieces and they're not going to work out, that has to be in my control. You also need to make sure that when you're doing tolling under eStewards, you inform the other countries, the other company that you're doing that work on behalf of, that there are export requirements placed on an eSteward processor, and then let them know what those relevant laws are. These conditions need to be contractually stipulated, and the contract will be canceled if you ever see evidence that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of exporting. So essentially, this allows something that occurs in our industry to occur openly within the certification. And that is when you do work and you don't take ownership of units, you can send them back to the company who's an eSteward, or as an eSteward, you're allowed to do this. This is not allowed under the R2 standard. Once you receive material on site, is considered to be under your ownership, and you are therefore responsible for fractions, pieces of it, recycling of the material, and data wiping. The other thing they added was conformance, or the review of conformance to any extended producer responsibility laws where that's applicable. So you live in a country where there's an extended producer responsibility law. It was never really something looked at by a certification auditor. Now a certification auditor, if you're an e-steward, can ask to see what records you have to demonstrate conformity with the requirements. They aren't auditing whether or not you're doing it all correctly, or if your tonnage is right, or if your reporting is accurate. They're just asking you for demonstration that you're conformity with the requirements. So you have it labeled on your legal requirements. You're able to show them that reporting. It's a pretty simple requirement, but it just sort of includes and acknowledges that that occurs in recyclers' facilities. They also added something called smaller qualified components and a precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle is really conceptual, and it's about being proactive as opposed to reactive and with certain activities. So you're not looking and waiting for conclusive evidence that there's possibly lead in the dust of the material you're shredding. You're assuming there is based on what you know is a constituent of a circuit board, and you're going to make sure that you do something proactive to manage that in terms of environmental health and safety prior to waiting for test results. So it's just being not reactive, but proactive in regards to all environmental health and safety risks. The qualified smaller components just gives a way to manage this kind of stuff without tracking serial numbers and being able to batch test things as long as they don't have data buried capabilities. So they are still a HEW, they are still things that we might be selling for resale, but they're so small and it doesn't make sense to be tracking this stuff on a small level with serial numbers. So you can batch test this. Of course, it does not include things like printers or monitors. We're talking little things, physically little things. They also reduced their IH monitoring. So historically, they've been very prescriptive on IH monitoring. So they reduced when you can test. Now it's every 3 years when your hazard is regularly shown below 80% of the regulatory limit. Where it was, now it's 50%, and they went from 80 and 99% at twice 6-month intervals to 50 and 99%, or that you're meeting the most stringent applicable regulatory limits. So they reduced the IH monitoring because they have enough historical data to realize they were maybe doing overkill or just maybe getting that baseline data. And they were able to say, we can step back a little bit from these requirements. And on top of that, we have more ROS compliant devices out there in the world, which means less chemical constituents in the creation of our units anyway. So they knew that they could reduce that. They also changed their opinion on, not opinion, but their status on prison operations. These were not allowed under the program before, but they are now allowed if particular criteria are met, and R2 also has a similar addition. I didn't talk about those two things, but I'll talk about those at the end of this. For eStewards, there can be no government subsidy. There can be no, they're not permitted to manage customer data after July 1, there's my helper, 2022, and the operation is fully in conformity with NAID. It also calls out occupational health and safety protections. And then they need to be able to demonstrate that it's to provide job training or future employment of prisoners upon release. So for resources for eStewards, they have the guidance document, which is actually very well done. Prima is their program administrator. She's excellent at getting back to you for going to questions. They have several videos on their website, and they have lead auditor training that we actually do for them. We've been holding those about twice a year. There's an internal auditor training that we host on our website for them that you can take. We just manage it for a small fee, but it's their program and their internal auditor training. And the Basel Treaty itself and understanding that is definitely a resource for eStewards. I wanted to say, because I had missed this with R2, that they do call out prison operations as being allowed if you can demonstrate that that they're paid fairly and that there's security around data. And I'm not going to remember the last thing. Oh, I know what it is. They do have a call out now for social accountability, at least in non-discrimination. It is just as a policy. That's all you need to required. You have that's a requirement is not really auditable in terms of how you implement that. So sorry to throw in that little R2 stuff at the end of the eStewards, but it made me think that I hadn't called that out. Both of these views of both of these standards were very high level. There are much more details involved in them, but I hope I gave you sort of a basis to begin with. Steve asked me to talk a little bit about, were people moving over from one to the other? What was I seeing? I have seen questions about moving to eStewards from R2. I have also seen some companies that were holding both standards to drop one or the other. I haven't seen people drop R2 any more than I've seen them drop eStewards. It's a pretty equal game. There are a lot less facilities certified to eStewards. I assume that's going to increase. I haven't had anybody, you know, I spent a lot of time with clients going over the differences between eStewards and R2. And some of the people that thought they wanted to move over because they had heard horror stories about R2v3 have chosen not to, but I'm sure that some of them will choose to. eStewards does require unannounced inspections, be allowed, and for some people that's problematic. I don't know why it would be problematic. They also do have a very open tracker program where they put trackers into devices that might hit your facility. So when they talk about being more secure about downstream due diligence, that is why they do. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if you're doing everything right. I'll open it up to questions for you guys.
Well, Kelley, thank you so much for trying to tackle this enormous, been 45 minutes. That's, I mean, we went beyond because
God,
it's
tough.
so important. And we're going to continue this just for a little longer to answer some of these questions that came through. And a good one. We talked about the deadline. Do you think that there's an appetite for either organization to extend the deadline, or do you think these things are going to be pretty hard and firm?
eStewards appears to be more flexible with things than R2 is able to. And the reason is that R2 is an accredited standard. So they have more rules around how they can't change things as easily. I haven't heard anything about that yet, though I know that everybody's worried. There's a big conversation about whether or not there's going to be enough auditors and everybody's going to have the time they need to get through this. And, COVID's played a big part of that. So I don't think so. I don't see that. I asked for remote audits for international facilities. I have a facility in Hong Kong and a facility in South Africa that had to start all over again because they couldn't get their, their stage 2 auditor in. One in Australia too. So, but they couldn't budge. They weren't willing to budge. So I just don't know. I just keep in touch. And if you're thinking of upgrading and putting it off, don't do it. It's not worth it. It's not that hard to upgrade. It's a little painful, but it's just easier to do it.
And the flip side, if somebody is unhappy with their auditor, how easy is it to bounce back and forth between, Perry Johnson or others, if you wanted to make a switch?
You can always ask for a new auditor. You don't have to keep your auditor. It's totally up to you. So it's harder to leave one CB for the other in a short notice, right? If you don't like Perry Johnson or Orion and now you want to move to the other, it's very simple to ask for another auditor. It happens all the time. I have auditors that people love, and then the next person I talk to absolutely hates that same auditor. So there's just people we connect with and people we don't connect with. And if you weren't happy with your auditor last time, and it wasn't because you were doing a crummy job, but because you just weren't connecting with them, you always have the opportunity. You are their client, right? Which is kind of an inherent problem with the CB scenario, but you are their client and they want you to be happy. So absolutely reach out and say, I'd like to have a different auditor this next time.
And then, with these changes and everything happens from a market standpoint, people are going to ask, is there a financial benefit? Is there a new business benefit for having one versus the other? Is there anything you're seeing on the marketplace that would lend credence to either one?
Lots of times when I talk to people and they're thinking of adding one versus the other or getting rid of one, the conversation centers around what their clients are requesting of them. So I would ask your clients if it matters, because that's who is going to help drive your decision. I don't think one is better than the other. I don't think one is, honestly, and I've said this from the beginning, much to the dismay of both of them. I don't think there's huge differences between them. And I say this because we prepare people for all versions of everything, right? So there are specific differences here and there in them. I mean, R2 right now is requiring either 4 standards or you could do R2 Rios. And I did want to mention this. eStewards is actually considering to approve Rios as their EMS. So that is new information. You know, choose one based on what your clients want of you. You know, and costs. Look at costs. What's it going to cost for you to get audited to all of these? What's the licensing fee involved with that? Consider that too. Sorry, I get asked it so much, and honestly, it really is such a specific decision based on what your clients want from you. I was just looking with somebody, she was thinking of moving to Rios, and she went through all of her contracts, and some of them specifically required ISO, but then in the last couple of years had added accepting Rios. So it was kind of interesting. She thought she couldn't move from ISO to Rios, and she could. So think about your marketability, think about who you want to maybe bring on as customers in the future, ask them what they might be needing. You know, I think that would be the best way to judge it, because very few of you are certified because you just want to be. It's helpful to your business, but most of you are certified because it's required of you. So who's asking it of you? Who do you want to get to be your customers in the future?
Well, Kelley, I know that there are a couple more questions that popped up, but we are a little bit over time. This has been fantastic. And before we left and broke, I want to, again, thank you for sharing your insight and trying to make sense of a very complicated subject in a very short period of time. That's why I think, Kelley, Greeneye Partners and your company exists, is because this is complicated and people need help. Reaching out to consultants like you is exactly, what they're going to need to do ultimately to be successful. But I just wanted to make one more quick little, Tara's next third Thursday webinar is again March the 17th. And something else that's coming that we're going to be talking a little bit more about in our next session next month is that, while these are great sessions, they're not very interactive for our members. And we want to start adding some additional value and benefits to our members to talk amongst themselves. So we've been talking about for a couple of months now the idea of creating some committees where maybe C-suite people or marketing people or operations people that have an opportunity to work together, talk together, and kind of be independent of the Tara structure, to be working together within the confines of the Tara membership. So we've got some people working on like maybe an idea or a beta testing a marketing committee idea. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the future, because here at Tara we gotta want to constantly bring you new member benefits like these conversations that we have every month. So thanks to everybody again for joining us today. Thank you, Kelley, for being our gracious host, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody again next month, third Thursday, March 17th.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.